LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Ring Rees-Mogg. Put your calls to Jacob Rees-Mogg now. 0345 6060 973. This is LBC.
It is indeed, and it's 4 minutes past 9 on Tuesday, the 15th of October, the morning after the Queen's speech the day before. More on the Queen's speech in a moment. Andrew, you'll be the first caller, but my opportunity to put my first question to you. Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you for coming to the studios, by the way.
It's a pleasure. I'm sorry I haven't been in recently.
You've had a few matters on your hand, and commiserations. I know you're a fervent cricket fan, and Somerset yet again came close but didn't pull it off in the county championships.
And it's such a shame. I did an event for the Telegraph, and I think the hardest question I've been asked this year was, would I rather Somerset won the county championship or we left the European Union on the 31st of October? And I was heckled in the audience by one of my children who said Somerset to win the county championship.
But you probably opted for what you believe to be right.
I'm afraid I did opt for it.
I've got to ask you, before we come to Andrew, the first caller, Mr. Rees-Mogg, will Britain Brexit on October the 31st?
Yes, I'm absolutely...
How so?
How so? Well, the government's working extraordinarily hard to get a deal.
More the House of Commons. This is, I would suggest.
If a deal is agreed with the European Union, it will get through, in my view, the House of Commons, because everybody's desperate to finish this. Even LBC's listeners and callers have probably had enough of talking about Brexit, and they want to talk about all the other things that we may do when we discuss the Queen's speech that are important to how their lives run. We've been doing this for 3.5 years. It can't go on forever. We are near a conclusion. And Parliament, once it's agreed something, can legislate very quickly. So if the meaningful vote goes through, then the legislation will merely be the ratification in domestic law of the treaty. And that, I think, is a relatively easy bill to pass if there is a deal.
But isn't that if the size of Texas, if Parliament agrees something, it can act fairly quickly? That's the big one, isn't it?
Yes, but I think the votes are now there
for
a deal. Yes, I think there is just a mood in the country, and politicians have to be, to some extent, sensitive to the national mood, that we want to get on with this. We want to get it completed. And the Prime Minister... You know, a lot of doubters around the Prime Minister saying he didn't really want to get a deal and so on and so forth. He has worked harder than anybody to get a deal and has made enormous strides to do things that were said to be impossible. The EU said it would never reopen the withdrawal agreement it had come to with Mrs May. It's reopened the withdrawal agreement. So big changes are happening, and I think that's very impressive, and I think it bodes very well for getting a deal through.
And are some of your former colleagues being tempted back into the broad church that is the Conservative Party?
Well, I always hope so. I mean, I've always believed in the Conservative Party being a broad church. I think that there is a place for people with other views, but that the one thing people shouldn't do is hand over control of the House of Commons to the opposition. That once you do that, you are part of the opposition rather than part of the government team.
Of course, David Gauke, saying he's one of your former colleagues, he was Justice Secretary, saying he feared the deal would be a no deal by another name. That doesn't augur well necessarily for him and some of the others that your party lost.
Well, I think that's an unfortunate turn of phrase from somebody who I think is highly distinguished and very likeable and a very devoted servant of the Conservative Party. But there's been a suspicion that people who say we don't want no deal really mean they don't want to leave the European Union. And I'm afraid comments like that make one think that Mr Gauke is heading in that direction. And if that's the direction he's going in, he should just stand up and say that he doesn't want to leave full stop, rather than saying, well, I'm going to throw rocks in the pool to make life difficult, to try and stop us leaving by essentially prestidigitation.
And lastly, could that be the reality of some of the other 20 plus of your former colleagues who've also left the party? Are they actually seeking to block Brexit by whatever means possible?
Well, some definitely aren't. Nick Bowles, who is left earlier and highly intelligent, capable man, has made it absolutely clear that he will vote for any reasonable deal. And so there are nuances in all groupings within the House of Commons.
Former Chancellor Philip Hammond?
Oh, well, he's been a great obstacle to Brexit the whole way through. If it hadn't been for him, we wouldn't be here.
So he's unlikely to rally behind the flag.
I'd be very surprised if he rallied behind any Conservative flag.
Shall we take the first call? Andrew's in Watford. Andrew, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Jacob.
Good morning, Andrew. Thank you for calling.
No worries. Given you have a majority of minus 41, what was the point of having a Queen's speech that's never going to get through Parliament?
That's a very wise question to ask. We needed a Queen's speech because conventionally a session of Parliament only lasts a year. This had already gone on for 2 years. And when you have a prorogation and a Queen's speech, you wipe the slate clean. And over a couple of years, you get all sorts of issues that have been raised in Parliament that are still hanging over, still appearing on the order paper, but are never going anywhere. And you need to cut those off and start again, and that's part of our routine constitutional process. But the other reason for a Queen's speech is that we need to get on with the domestic legislative agenda and challenge the opposition. They won't have a general election, so we can't get to a new agenda that way. So we have to do it via a Queen's speech. And we've set out 22 bills in the Queen's speech. Some of these will have cross-party support. There's a great deal of support for Helen's Law, for example, or for the Environment Bill. And day by day we'll be saying to the opposition, put your money where your mouth is. Don't just oppose for the sake of it. These are exciting things that will improve the nation. Do you want to cut knife crime, or don't you care about the security of people living in the country? And that will help us govern better, or we'll see the opposition for their true colours, merely obstructive and obstreperous.
Andrew, a response?
Well, you've still got the majority of minus 41, so I don't see how you're going to do it.
I mean, I think, let me just to underscore, Andrew, don't go, but I hear what you say as regards the environment, but certain key issues, possibly as law and order bills or even health services, as Andrew rightly says, you haven't got the numbers, Rees. This is like Somerset winning the World Cricket Championship, not just the county championship. It's about as likely as that, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Well, Somerset has a very fine team. I think that's going to be happening quite soon,
don't think it would beat England, really, when we go.
Look, I understand the point you're making, but we needed a Queen's speech. What do you do in that Queen's speech? Do you set out ambitious targets for what you want to do? Do you set out your true beliefs and how you think you make the country better? Or do you, in a mealy-mouthed way, say we will...
But it's make-believe, isn't it? Isn't it, Andrew, lastly, is it not make... But put that to Jacob Rees-Mogg. The final point to you, sir.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Nick. There isn't... You set out something that you can't come through on because you haven't got the majority in the House. You're basically you're fighting a losing battle. You need to get your majority back, and then you should have then you could have had the Queen's speech. You've done this the wrong way round.
But the only way to get a majority is to have a general election. And because of the ridiculous Fixed Term Parliament Act, we can't get to a general election. Therefore, we have to challenge the opposition and say, look, do you care about crime? Do you care about the health service? Do you want these improvements to come through? Or do you just want to sit on the sidelines and oppose? And I think actually that will really put pressure on the socialists to see what their true colours are. And we may find we get some surprising things through because actually they daren't oppose efforts to reduce knife crime.
Andrew, thank you. Before we move on to Jiggs, who's the next caller, let's just look at an email coming in from Rachel and Bexley, who says, I respect you, Jacob Rees-Mogg. You're an honest man and you have a faith. Will you be able to go to meet your maker, I'm sure it's many years away, and able to say you did not lie to the monarch?
Yes.
Nice way she's put it, isn't it? There's a suggestion you misled the Queen earlier in the summer, I should say.
It's a most charming question, and Rachel, thank you for sending in that email, so beautifully phrased.
Did you fib to the monarch?
No. As a dutiful Catholic, I periodically go to confession, and this is not something I've had to confess. But it misunderstands how the Privy Council works.
I know you can't share what you said.
That's right.
I appreciate but what can you tell us? Just to allay the suggestions you misled.
I can tell you how the Privy Council works, because that is public. So what happens is, there I was in Balmoral with my sovereign, and I read out various things. So one of them was that James Cleverly had become a member of Her Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council, at which point the Queen says, approved. Next thing I read out is that Parliament will be prorogued between such and such date and such date, and a commission will be drawn up, and the Queen says, approved. We don't sit round having a chat over a cup of tea and a bun about whether this is the right way to do government policy. It's a very formal approach. It's a bit like the Speaker saying, the ayes have it. It's that type of formality, and therefore that's why I can answer the question with such certainty, that there's no question of lying. You're making a statement about something that should happen, and the Queen formally approves it.
And has previous detail been submitted to her or one of her councillors to subject, or is it just that she effectively, and I don't mean this in a she simply rubber stamps it?
Well, constitutionally, there is formal advice given by the Prime Minister to the Queen, and that is what you might call capital A advice.
Were you privy to that?
Well, let me explain how that works, rather than what I was privy to. When the Prime Minister gives capital A advice, it would be the most extraordinary circumstances where the sovereign refused it. It's not completely impossible, but it is extremely unlikely. I think had a Prime Minister asked to prorogue for a year, which the Supreme Court got very upset about and muddled about, in my view, but nonetheless, the Queen may well have refused at that point, because it would have been a clear abuse.
So that is where she can seek further input, or why do you want 12 months, Mr Johnson?
If it were extreme, and there was always the question before the Fixed Term Parliament Act, if the Prime Minister lost an election and went to the Queen and instead of resigning, say, I want another election, the Queen, even though that would have been capital A advice, would have been expected to say no. Right. And that was quite clearly established, I think, in the Lassalle's principles. So there are very, very rare circumstances where the Queen can say no to capital A advice, but this clearly wasn't one of them. So the Prime Minister would have given the advice, the Queen would have accepted it, then the Privy Council meets. Now, the question that I think underlies Rachel's question and your probing is what happens first. And there are, of course, discussions between private secretaries to see what is being asked for if it will be approved. Because nobody ever wants to get to the stage where the Queen says no to capital A advice. No, because that's a real constitutional smash.
Yeah.
And so the various private secretaries say, this is what's coming, what do you think? There are
discreet soundings.
Discreet soundings, to which I am not privy, the Prime Minister isn't privy, but it's done at an official level. And if it is thought that the capital A advice is within the normal constitutional bounds, the Prime Minister formally makes it to the Queen, and then the Privy Council formally approves. So, Rachel, again, thank you for your beautifully phrased question.
Yes.
But when I meet my maker, assuming he isn't sending me down beforehand, which I hope not, the question of advice to Her Majesty, I doubt, will be the first topic of conversation.
Jiggs is in Bexley. Jiggs, you're on the radio. Good morning. What question do you have for Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, good morning, Jacob, and thanks for taking the calls. I really appreciate that. Jacob, my question is that, the government has now had more time to prepare for leaving Europe. We hear this, leaving Europe in October. We hear this through the government advertising all the time, so we know that it's happening. But the question is, why at the moment has the government not released any publicly available costed report which shows the financial effect of the Yellowhammer identified concerns?
This is just to remind us, since Yellowhammer was, of course, the so-called worst-case scenarios, what would happen with a no-deal Brexit. Jiggs, stay on the line, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Jiggs, and I'm glad you're hearing the adverts. I hope they're coming across on LBC very clearly.
And I was also in a motorway service area, and there were two young people ready to give leaflets to lorry drivers.
Absolutely. It's and they're on the overhead gantries, which is very useful, and it's a good way of getting the message across. And money's being put towards ensuring leaving without a deal is a smooth process, and the Chancellor, I think...
So how is Yellowhammer not accurate in any way, shape or form?
But the Chancellor's made, I think, £8 billion available. So a lot of money has been made available to ensure that we are ready, doing things that we will have to do anyway as we leave the European Union. So this is well-spent money. Every single economic forecast around Brexit's been nonsense. We were told that we would have a recession, a rise in unemployment of, 800,000. This was the Treasury telling us this, and the Bank of England, simply by voting to leave. So we've had all sorts of ridiculous, gloomy forecasts that have turned out to be pie in the sky.
Mr. Rees-Mogg, they were right about the pound against the euro and the dollar.
But the pound is one of the automatic stabilisers, and they didn't... It's
114 now. It was 142 on the day of the vote on the euro.
But they made their assumptions assuming nothing would happen to the pound. This is one of the great failures of economic forecasters, that they think other things will be equal, other things never are equal, other things change and adjust. Economies are dynamic, and so one of the things that meant the economy has done so well is the fall in the pound, which has boosted exporters and has been very helpful to our economic performance. And that's why these forecasts are unlikely to be right, these economic models are unlikely to be right, and so why on earth put out things that you don't believe in?
Final comment from you, Jiggs.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. The situation, there's more of a financial commentary by the Downing Street, really, rather than other economists, just so we can have your views on the financial. But the response really is that what I'm really concerned about is the voting patterns. And so, for example, if you take your voting patterns, whether it's against, not supporting an increase in any way at all about the welfare rights or illnesses or disabilities or reduction of welfare benefits and so on, but yet you've supported regularly.
Thank you. I'm glad you've raised that, because if you look at They Work For You, it's very misleading on how people vote. It says, I voted against an inquiry into the Iraq War, is one of the things it says about me. I wasn't in Parliament when most of those votes took place. There was one vote on an opposition motion when there was already an inquiry going on. And it says, I was unlike other Tory MPs. No, I wasn't in Parliament at that point. And so these things are very misleading. On welfare, the Conservative Party's record is extremely good. Universal Credit has helped 200,000 people get into work, and it's ensuring that work always pays. But the opposition...
Its introduction wasn't particularly spectacular. Right. Well, I have to put that to you, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Actually, I think...
Well, please don't tell me you think it was introduced perfectly.
But wisely, because it was done in stages. If you think
people didn't get payments for months, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
But if you think of tax credits, they were introduced overnight, and you had hundreds of thousands of problems. With the universal credit, it was introduced in stages so that the problems could be dealt with. I accept there were problems, of course I do.
Because it had to be redone. You will accept that, because you don't redo something if it's perfect.
No, but the problems were done on a test level so that you weren't affecting the whole country. And I think that was a really sensible thing to do. But what They Work For You reveals is that I voted against opposition motions of a motherhood and apple pie kind saying Yabu sucks to the government. So, Jiggs, I wouldn't take those too seriously.
There's adverts of a Twitter account. This isn't even yours sometimes. They made up a Twitter account.
Saying that I tweeted something in 2011. Yeah. I didn't tweet until 2017.
No, you weren't even on. Yeah, I remember that one as well. Yeah. Jiggs, thank you. Nigel in Chelsea. Nigel, you're on the radio. Your question, if you would. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Good morning, Jacob.
Good morning, Nigel.
A man for whom I have always had the most immense respect.
Oh, thank you.
However, Jacob,
I thought there was a but coming.
There is a but coming, and here it is. When Mrs. May's surrender treaty was first published, I have to print things out because I'm no good at reading long documents on screen. I went through it and I highlighted 47 paragraphs, which I found completely objectionable. And so my question to you is, and I gather about three of it, from what we hear, it seems that about three of these paragraphs have been dropped. Did you count the number of paragraphs you objected to in May's original deal?
I can briefly show off about my technological ability, because I read the agreement, draft agreement, on an iPad going into Robert Peston's show. And when I got there, I was very surprised to find that Robert himself, I always thought was more technologically advanced than I am, had it all printed out for him in hard copy. Anyway, Nigel, you make a very important point. I do think the major problem with that agreement was the backstop, because it was the backstop in conjunction with Article 4, which is a key article, and the Article 184 on the political declaration, that meant we would remain the vassal state. So that was the problem with the agreement as it was. If you take out the backstop, then the operations of Article 4 and Article 184 on a renewed political declaration become much less problematic. So if I can give you some reassurance on how this deal looks as if it is, and I don't know all the details, going to be very, very significantly different and will not leave us subject to the EU's fiat once we've left the European Union.
Quick response from you, Nigel.
Well, I take the point about the backstop, but is it not the case that we're still signed up to huge swathes of security agreements, including potentially the European Army, that the jurisdiction of the ECJ is going to continue for an indeterminate number of years? And I point out to you that in the treaty, the termination date, which could have been given as 2025 or whatever, is actually 20XX. So that means they're not even expecting necessarily this to be terminated in the 2020s.
Nigel, you make very fair points. The jurisdiction of the ECJ is something that I am not in favour of. But you need to ask, what do they have jurisdiction over? They have jurisdiction over the payments that we will be making to them to ensure that they are made under EU law. The overwhelming bulk of those will have happened within the first 3 years. You will have, in 60 years' time, potentially, that we owe them £5 million a year, over which they will have jurisdiction. But it's very small. It's a very long tail of very little significance. Right. They also have a very limited ability for their judgments to be taken into account by our courts on EU member state nationals' rights for the first 8 years after we've left. So, Nigel, your principled point is right, but I think it's worth looking through at the detail and seeing whether, in the interests of leaving with an agreement, these are compromises that even those of us, and I'm in this category, who are most suspicious of the ECJ, think we can live with because it doesn't give them leverage into our whole political system. The backstop gave the ECJ leverage into our whole political system.
All right. Nigel, thank you. The backstop has gone. What is the replacement? What is the solution, Mr. Rees-Mogg, as you see it?
Look, these discussions are taking place at the moment, and I don't know what is being discussed in Brussels minute by minute. Basically, I'm trusting Boris Johnson because he has been a Brexiteer since before the term Brexiteer existed. He's put his political career on the line, I think, 3 times. Very early on, according to Andrew Mitchell, John Major tried to keep him off the candidates list because of what he was writing about the failings of the EU. He then was offered all sorts of baubles by David Cameron, which he refused to lead the Leave campaign, and then he resigned as Foreign Secretary because he thought the Chequers deal was so rotten. And just to add to his many glories, on Meaningful Vote 3, he was less willing to vote for it than I was, and I'm not a particularly mealy-mouthed Europhile. So I think we can trust the Prime Minister to deliver in the negotiations that are going on.
But he's got to take the DUP with him.
We're a unionist party. I mean, people make it sound as if we've got to drag them along kicking and screaming. The Conservative Party does not want to do something that is a risk to the United Kingdom. And we believe in our country, and our country is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
So there's no way he'd try and proceed without the support of the DUP?
Let's take unionism as a whole, because Lady Herman, who is a unionist, always ticks me off when I say we must always listen to the DUP, and I like and admire many members of the DUP. It's a fine party which shares a lot of values in common with the Conservative Party. But we're looking at unionism as a whole, and the DUP are the biggest representatives of unionism in Parliament assembled. So their view is obviously important, but unionism is the key driving force.
So they have got to be on board?
I would be very surprised if they weren't on board.
And if they're on board the ERG, which you used to chair, the ERG are on board?
Well, you'll have to wait and see what comes out. I can't
wait. I'm too excited. I need to...
You're very impatient,
I need to know
Mr.
now.
Ferrari.
I need to know now. I'm too excited.
It's too early in the morning to be excited. You're like one of my children on a birthday, you know.
Well, I'm sure they do very well, and quite rightly so. But you do need the DUP and the ERG, don't we?
For this to get through the House of Commons, the parliamentary arithmetic almost certainly requires the DUP and the ERG to be on board, yes.
2 other questions. Hannah's in Balham. Hannah, you're on the radio through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead, Hannah.
Good morning, Nick. Good morning, Jacob.
Hello, Hannah.
Good morning, Hannah.
My question is this. Considering that there are millions in poverty and using food banks and baby banks and etc., how can your party justify essentially what is a charge to now vote, considering a driving licence is £34 and a passport is £72.50?
This is, of course, the suggestion that you need photo ID as a result of limited, but there does appear to have been some kind of, unfortunately, voter or electoral fraud, the idea from the government that you have photo ID. Mr. Rees-Mogg?
This has been used in Northern Ireland for some years to ensure that personation doesn't take place. The integrity of our voting system is important, and we need to ensure that people who vote are entitled to vote and that they don't vote more than once. And I think there are issues with postal voting as well, probably bigger issues with postal voting. But that councils will make available identity cards to people who don't have any existing identity cards, and that will be done for free. Nobody will be stopped from voting.
So you don't have to buy a passport for £70, I think. What was Hannah? Well, Hannah, that does seem to answer it. So the local authority will fall to those who don't have any money. They will be given a card free. Are you more relaxed now, Hannah?
Slightly, but what disturbs me is that this Conservative government feel the need to take away a right to vote, essentially, that we have been given by putting a charge on it, and I would hope that they would reconsider their position.
But there won't be a charge. I'm absolutely certain there will not be a charge.
Right.
There may be some administrative inconvenience for people getting an identity card, and it's very, very important that this does not become identity cards by the back door, which I'm glad to say is not government policy and has been consistently opposed by the Conservatives.
Hannah, thanks for your call. I think that probably, I think the last thing they're trying to do is to stop you voting. They will facilitate it, but there will be some paperwork to go through. Let's try and get at least a couple more. Hannah, thank you. Phil in Crawley. Phil, you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead. Good morning.
Morning, Nick. Morning, Jacob.
Good morning, Phil.
Hi. Theresa May has done a lot of damage to Brexiteers, and the last hope really is Boris Johnson, yourself and others. The rumours are that basically what we're probably going to get is a reheated May withdrawal agreement or surrender, whichever way you want to look at it. Are you and Boris and the rest prepared for the backlash that will come at a general election if we are stitched up? And
what do you mean by stitched up? In a sentence, what do you mean by stitched up, Phil?
By basically bringing back Theresa May's ridiculous surrender.
OK. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Phil, I think you make a very important political point, which is why I think that's not what's going to happen. As I was saying earlier, I'm comfortable trusting Boris Johnson in the negotiations he's doing, that he is as staunch a Brexiteer as anybody, and that if the backstop is removed and we have different arrangements in relation to Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, then it will not be Mrs. May's deal.
It's not a May rehash.
But, yes, if we came back with Mrs. May's deal with a cherry on the top, there would be electoral consequences. I don't like cherries much, so I hope it isn't Mrs. May's deal with a cherry on the top.
Last one from Jonathan in Plymouth. Jonathan, your question to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead. Good morning.
Good morning. I have to say it's a great pleasure to be calling in Mr. Rees-Mogg.
Well, thank you, Jonathan.
We didn't get the right set of callers today, did we, Mr. Rees-Mogg? They all seem to like you. I don't know. We'll review this list. For your question, if I could move you to that, Jonathan, I'd be grateful.
Yes, of course. Sorry.
Not at all, sir.
My question is...
Thank you.
How will history judge Mr. Bercow as Speaker of the House of Commons?
How? Now, that's a great one with which to finish this
That
session.
is a really good question, Jonathan, with which
I'm going to study Mr. Rees-Mogg in the eyes, because you have been a tremendous supporter of Mr. Bercow.
Absolutely. And as I said to Mr. Speaker yesterday, he has a reception after the Queen's speech. One of the reasons I've always been a fan of his is I think the first Christmas party I went to as an MP with two children I then had, he said, what a very pretty girl my little girl Mary is, and anyone who says nice things about my little girl, I am a great admirer of. It's a very easy way.
Well, I've complimented you on one of your sons, so I got it wrong there.
It's a very easy way to get me on side. I think we need to look at Mr. Bercow in the round, and not just in his behaviour in the last year. I think he's been a very important speaker in helping backbenchers hold the government to account, and that's been a thoroughly good thing to do. I think urgent questions, the selection of amendments to bills, the use of emergency debates has had many successes in allowing, as I did for a constituent before I got into government, to help get a drug for Batten's disease. And the Speaker helped me use every parliamentary mechanism to put pressure on the government.
Yes.
And that's been very important because it has helped the House of Commons do its job.
I sense a but.
But there is a but coming. And Mr. Speaker knows this. I mean, I'm not saying anything publicly that I haven't told him. I think in the last year, he has got it wrong. He has misunderstood Erskine May and the importance of convention and precedent. He has misunderstood the need to be seen to be impartial. And he has made statements outside Parliament giving his views of the state of affairs, which he has no business doing. The Speaker shouldn't say anything out of Parliament other than describing how the House of Commons operates to school children or something very, very uncontentious. And so I am worried that the last year will damage the reputation he's had for the good he did before. And so I think we need to look at his tenure in the round, not just at the last year.
Who will enjoy your support as his replacement?
The answer to that is that anybody I supported, it would be absolutely the black finger.
I was going to urge you not to name them, because that would be the end.
Being supported by any member of the government would not be a good thing. But there are lots of great candidates with many different virtues.
Possibly even more grave matters than that. The Turkish-Syrian border, the matters there. Little action, one has to say, from the European Union. Possibly little action from the United Kingdom. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
It is a terrible dilemma. The actions of the Turkish government have been condemned by the British government. The Prime Minister spoke to President Erdogan and made clear that the British government did not support what he was doing, and is very concerned about what's happening with Daesh, and that the priority is to defeat wicked terrorists in Syria, and that must be the absolute focus of government policy. But Turkey is a NATO ally, and it's really difficult when an ally in the most important security organisation for world peace is doing things which other NATO allies disagree with deeply, and is having the most appalling consequences. People are dying because of this. I mean, it is the most serious.
But can I put it to you, they're dying because of another member of NATO, President Trump, and his actions. He's the author of this, isn't he?
Well, it's not for me to say how America should distribute her troops. That's a matter for the American government and the American people.
Last night's events in the football match, I know you're a cricket man, but you probably have a knowledge of a football game where, yet again, England players were subjected to racist taunts. They decided to play on rather than walk off. Correct decision?
I understand both sides of this argument, actually. I think there's something rather wonderful in beating horrid racist-supported sides 6-0. I think there is a glory in annihilating people who behave so badly, or their supporters do, and just showing them that you may be a nasty, racist, loathsome type, but we'll win. And we'll win because we've got better values and we've got better football players. And I think I absolutely understand why other people say they should have walked off, but I do think there's something marvellous that it was an absolute crushing defeat for a side supported by such loathsome people.
And lastly, to lift the mood, I show you a picture in one of the newspapers, a picture in many where this is at the state opening of Parliament, and you're not just laughing. And of course, the photographers follow your actions in the House of Commons regularly, whatever you may be doing, whether you're relaxing or, in this instance, you're not just laughing. I mean, what is the gag you've just been told?
Well, look, in that photograph, I'm speaking to Stephen Pound,
yes,
the most charming Labour MP, who is also one of the most...
Ealing North, yes, good bloke.
One of the most amusing men in the House of Commons. Almost anything Stephen says makes you laugh, so it was clearly an uplifting comment, but I can't remember precisely what.
And on that moment, we've got... Of course, you're the Cabinet's success, or the House of Commons' success with you as leader, means that it's our game, because you're no longer able to appear on LBC, but you come and see me every now and again.
You're very kind. I miss my Friday evening show. But,
some would argue the way it's going, you might be back soon, but I'm sure...
Will you have me?
Of course, not that we'll need you. You'll go on to greater heights. Jacob Rees-Mogg appearing here on LBC When News is next.
The Commons leader Jacob Rees-Mogg has told LBC he thinks the votes are there in Parliament for a Brexit deal to be passed. Negotiations are